An August evening over Japan. The sky is painted in deep shades of sunset, the clouds are softly illuminated with gold, and it seems that this day is coming to an end in complete harmony. People on the ground raise their heads. A Boeing 747, a huge car, a symbol of the era and the pride of the aircraft industry, passes majestically over them. For turbofan engines roar steadily, like a powerful chorus, and at first glance there is not a drop of threat in this. It's not just an airplane, it's the Queen of Heaven, time-tested, reliable, and familiar. But the reality inside the building is already beginning to break this illusion. Alarms flash in the cabin, sirens howl so that they cannot be silenced. The captain and his assistant grab the controls, but their efforts are in vain. The ear, weighing hundreds of tons, has stopped obeying. What should have been an extension of the pilot's arms turned into dead levers. The hydraulics, the nervous system of the aircraft, is silent. The most complex machine that connects man and metal suddenly cut off this connection. It is at this moment that what will be the scariest memory of their lives begins for passengers. Oxygen masks are being fired from the ceiling, one after the other. They hang from thin tubes, sway in the turbulent air, and hundreds of hands frantically grab them. Parents are holding masks to their children's faces, and someone is trying to fasten a rubber band on their head with trembling fingers. But the air, which should give relief, brings only awareness. If their masks have fallen out, the situation is critical. People hurriedly write farewell lines on notebooks, on the backs of tickets, on anything. The words that should outlive them are born in panic and shaky handwriting. And there's a gaping wound in the back of the plane. Where there should have been a solid, airtight bulkhead, tail, and rudder, there is now only torn metal. The explosive decompression, like a giant fist, knocked out an entire piece of the structure. Streams of air howl outward, carrying away the paneling, seats, and panels. Every new moment is another step into the abyss. Passengers do not see this picture, but they already feel its consequences: wild vibrations, unnatural lurches, the feeling that the Earth is approaching. And this is the paradox. From the outside, from the ground, the liner still looks majestic, a blue and white silhouette against a red sunset. People are taking pictures of him, not even suspecting that there is a desperate struggle going on inside right now. The contrast between the external calm and the internal chaos tears the imagination. How is this possible? How did a car built by thousands of engineers and tested in tens of thousands of flights suddenly have a whole tail disappear? What kind of unnoticeable mistake, what kind of forgotten seam or poor quality repairs turned this flight from a routine into a disaster? And most importantly, will the pilots, left without control tools, be able to pull more than 500 people out of the heavenly trap? These questions are still unanswered. But to understand why the metal giant suddenly lost its tail, you need to go back a little bit, to the moment when everything seemed calm and predictable. When hundreds of people boarded the plane, thinking only about meeting their families and starting the holiday. This evening had its own plan. Thousands of people are traveling around the country to catch a glimpse, airports are buzzing, and the green, on time, signs are flashing. Tokyo's Haneda works like a well-oiled mechanism, hoses are fed to the sides, tractors take away heavy liners with the precision of an orchestra. In the stream of metal giants is our 747. It requires no attention, a proven car, a familiar route, less than an hour to Osaka. The mundane is his best disguise. Passengers board their worlds. Someone is taking gifts to their relatives, someone is leafing through a fresh newspaper, someone is falling asleep even before taxiing. The children's laughter dissolves into the hum of the air conditioners, the curtains of the portholes flap softly, like the pages of a book. The flight attendants close the luggage racks, a characteristic click sequentially passes through the cabin, as if a zipper snaps shut. Nothing unusual. And it is this nothing that is the main intrigue. When everything is calm, the last thing people expect is that an invisible mistake is on its way. There's a different scene in the cockpit, stern and focused. In the left seat is a pilot being instructed, preparing for promotion. Hundreds of hours in the simulator, thousands in the sky, today he is entrusted with the role of leader, under the supervision of an experienced captain on the right. Behind the backs is a flight engineer, a man who hears an airplane through instruments as clearly as a musician hears a false note. They work without fuss, control cards, mutual confirmations, nods. On board, nutrition is normal, fuel is calculated, system pressure is in the green zone. 3 pairs of eyes and 3 different horizons of attention add up to a common one. Lights are flashing outside, along the taxiway. The tractor is disconnected, and the heavy liner is already breathing by itself. The auxiliary power plant hums at the tip of the tail, the power grid outputs stable frequencies, the air conditioning equalizes the climate by zones, the sensors inflate the sealed capsule of the future flight with a precisely calculated airflow. The climb is still ahead, which means that the pressure cycle in the cabin will begin its usual dance again. The higher, the thinner the air outside, the more carefully the automation supports the home indicators for humans inside. As the car rolls towards the executive start, the dispatcher's voices are in the headphones, permits, traffic directions, speeds. The captain, without haste, pronounces the critical points, the speed of decision-making, the speed of separation, the lane margin, alternative scenarios of departure. It's not a dramatization, it's a craft. The paradox of aviation is that the safest transport achieves its safety precisely by being always ready for the unexpected. Jagged procedures are like seat belts for thoughts. At the same moment, the invisible steward of fate makes his hidden mark. There is a long-standing entry in the technical journal of this car: once, during a hard landing, the tail was hit. Then, repair, control, signatures. Technically, everything is fine. In fact, somewhere in the thickness of the metal there is something that is not visible to the eye. Material fatigue is the same reality as human fatigue, only without complaints and requests for a day off. And if a person can say, "I need to rest," metal speaks only in cracks, microscopic at first, then more and more understandable. But today, not a single eye, not a single device in the cockpit sees this conversation. Permission to take off comes exactly like a metronome. The engines enter takeoff mode, their hum becomes monolithic, the aircraft accelerates, the nose is slightly unloaded, the landing gear knocks on the concrete slabs, short and elastic. Their solution sounds in the headsets, the hand remains on the rods for another fraction of a second, and the liner easily, as if remembering how it is done, transfers the weight from the wheels to the air. The strip goes back, the city turns into a pattern of lights, the bay into a black expanse. It's just like in the textbook. The first spread is like turning a page. The autopilot catches the course, the flight engineer notes the output parameters, temperatures at the outlet of the turbines, fuel consumption by group, pressure in hydraulic systems A, B, C. The numbers add up in harmony. Passengers have their own little theater, seat belts are still fastened, drinks are making noise in the carts, the first photos on film are through the thick glass of the porthole. The sky promises a smooth route, and the forecast shows only rare thunderstorms to the south, which are easily bypassed by an agreed deviation. If security had a sound, it would be like the smooth whistling of air through the skin. The higher the liner goes over the bay, the more accurately the automation keeps the pressure in the cabin. This is a subtle physics. There are fewer air molecules in the external environment, but inside you have to create a piece of land, a comfortable height. The exhaust valves work in time, the sensors compare the set values with the actual ones, and the flight engineer casts only brief glances, routinely, without alarm. He knows that if something goes wrong, the instruments will scream first. It is in this quiet confidence that intrigue lives. That's right, everything is according to procedure, but does danger have to like loud foreplay? Sometimes she prefers to whisper. Its convenient time is when people's attention becomes lazier and the systems more predictable. At such moments, we especially trust routine, and routine especially does not like surprises. There is warm light in the cabin, smooth traction, and the feeling that arrival is almost a gift to the schedule. Airport opening hours are tailored to the traffic flow, the route is short and familiar, and the crew is strong and well coordinated. If someone now offered to bet that this flight would require 3 people in the cockpit to do the impossible, they would not be believed. And yet it is here, in a perfectly arranged sequence of small, yes, everything is fine, that the opposite is already sitting, a series of ifs that have not yet been uttered. If the old seam has ever received an extra load. If one of the valves held the pressure a little longer than it was worth. If metal remembers more than people do. The captain checks alternatives in case of a return, the pilot being instructed repeats the descent profile to the original airfield in his head, the flight engineer mentally replays the algorithm for emergency landing gear release, simply because it is part of the ritual. They are preparing for something that almost always remains only in the checklists. Almost. And this, near probability, is the thinnest film between everyday life and the test. This is how the paradox of the scene is born: the calmer the surroundings, the stronger the coming waves. On the one hand, there is a polished predictability of the graph, an estimated height, and a route along which you can draw a line with a ruler. On the other hand, the deep mechanics of the aircraft, which cannot be seen from the seat, cannot be heard over the noise of the air conditioners, and cannot be read on the face of the person next to them. Hidden in this silence is a question that has not yet been answered: what exactly has already prepared for itself the right to interfere in the ideal order? The sun's disk is fading over the bay, the lights below are getting brighter, and the portholes are giving off soft reflections. Somewhere near the curtain, one passenger adjusts the child's belt, another carefully puts her purse under the seat, the third freezes with the camera, catching the sunset. In the cockpit there is another report to the dispatcher: hold the level, follow the course, wait for further instructions. And if fate had a phrase for such moments, it would sound simple: go ahead. Just a little more. Everything looks perfect. It is here, on the border of the ordinary and the irreversible, that history takes off. The car is heavy, the program is simple, and the people are attentive. And yet, at the end of this smooth streak of events, there is not a smooth landing, but a struggle for every second and every meter of air. But for this struggle to become clear, we need to see how perfect the start looked. The more perfect the painting was before, the more contrasting the blow will be after. Each car carries its own biography. For passengers, the plane is just the flight number, the white and blue hull, and the flight attendants at the entrance. But for engineers, every machine stores the memory of every flight, every repair, every deviation from the norm. Flight 123 had this memory going back 11 years ago, to Osaka, when the plane hit the runway with its tail. In the language of aviation, this is called hard landing, a hard landing. In the language of fate, this was the first step towards disaster. Then the liner was stopped. He was sent to the hangar, where specialists had to repair the damaged bulkhead in the tail section. This detail is a key one, a kind of plug, for all the pressure in the cabin. The bulkhead resembles a huge dome that holds the air that accumulates in the sealed hull. Not only comfort depends on it, but also the very possibility of flying at high altitudes, where without cabin pressure a person loses consciousness in a matter of seconds. The engineers who carried out the repairs knew that if the job was done perfectly, the plane would continue to fly for decades to come. But here the human factor intervened: errors in the restoration, the wrong number of rivets and plates, a slight deviation from the scheme. On paper, everything looked fixed. The report said, the aircraft is ready for operation. In fact, there was already a time bomb inside the metal. And every flight turned that timer on. With each climb, as the pressure inside the fuselage increased, the bulkhead experienced a load. It's like inflating a balloon every day that once had a tiny incision. The first hundreds of inflations will go unnoticed. 1,000, 2,000, the ball will hold. But each time, the invisible crack will slowly spread until one day it breaks through. For the passengers, it was a normal flight, tea, newspapers, conversations. But for metal, it was a 12,000th pressure injection cycle. On that day, the cracks in the bulkhead were no longer microscopic, they had become a network of fatigue hidden deep in the structure. The liner looked impressive, but its back was weakened. The plane is like a man who has been carrying a disease inside himself for many years, which does not manifest itself in any way. On the outside, he's healthy, strong, and familiar. But every new day brought closer the moment when the body would stop holding on. The Boeing 747 Flight 123 was flying on its regular, unremarkable route, and no one on board, neither the crew nor the passengers, knew that an invisible countdown was ticking inside the metal body. The 747 was traveling at an altitude of about 24,000 feet, gaining a stable cruising range. Everything looked perfect, the autopilot was on course, the flight engineer was monitoring the instruments, the passengers had already relaxed and were preparing for a short flight. But it was at this moment, when the illusion of safety was complete, that something happened in the depths of the tail section of the aircraft that no one expected. The bulkhead, which had been pressed by pressure and discharge cycles for 11 years, could not stand it. At first, there was a quiet crunch of metal, invisible and inaudible. The crack, which had been hiding in the structure for a long time, suddenly spread with a jerk, like a fracture on glass. This was followed by a thud, an instantaneous jerk of the hull, and a split second later, an explosive compression of air. Inside the cabin, it felt like a sudden pop and a stab in the back, and outside, it was as if a giant hand had torn off a piece of the plane. The air mass inside the liner, which was under pressure, rapidly rushed out. The flow was so powerful that it not only tore off the panels and seat headrests, but also tore out a huge piece of the tail section. The rudder, hydraulic systems, and tail auxiliary equipment went with it. In fact, the spine was torn out of the whole body of the plane. There was a panic in the cabin. People were thrown in their chairs, things flew out of someone's hands, someone heard the paneling being carried away with a bang behind them. The air whistled like a hurricane rushing into the room. At the same moment, oxygen masks collapsed from the ceiling. They hit the passengers' faces, swayed in the turbulence, and hundreds of hands reached out to them at the same time. But even wearing a mask didn't save you from feeling terrified. Everyone knew that if a plane lost its tail, it was more than an accident. This is the end of control. In the cockpit, everything looked even scarier. Alarm sirens started screaming at the same time. The lights came on, the instruments showed a sharp loss of pressure in the cabin. But almost immediately, the pilots noticed a much more eerie detail: the arrows of the hydraulic systems began to fall rapidly. A second, 2, 3, and all three independent hydraulic systems, A, B and C, showed 0. It was a verdict. The 747 was operated by hydraulics. Steering wheels, pedals, levers, all these are just commands that were transmitted through pressure to the steering surfaces on the wings and tail. Without hydraulics, all these controls turned into useless metal. And now the pilots understood. They were sitting in the cockpit of a giant that no longer had muscles. They push, pull, twist, but the plane does not respond. The captain gave a distress signal, code 7700, on the transponder. The dispatcher in Tokyo understood. This is not an ordinary problem. The aircraft's icon was flashing on the radar screens, but the crew's voice was strangled and strained. They tried to turn back, but the airliner began to roll unnaturally onto the wing. The passengers felt new movements. The plane wasn't just shaking, it was being tossed from side to side like a leaf in the wind. This phenomenon is called the Dutch pitch, when, due to the loss of the stabilizer, the aircraft begins to sway, entering into a resonance between roll and yaw. For the passengers, it was like a wild sea, first tilting to the right, then sharply to the left, and so on over and over again. People clutched at the armrests, and screams and crying could be heard in the cabin. But the horrors didn't stop there. The loss of pitch control led to another phenomenon, Hugo fluctuations. The plane would turn its nose sharply up, lose speed, and then just as sharply fall down, gaining speed and rising again. This cycle was repeated over and over again. For the people on board, it turned into a hellish roller coaster ride, only with no protection and no hope of ending. Everything that was happening looked like a catastrophic paradox. One of the largest and most reliable machines in the world, built on thousands of engineering solutions, suddenly became completely paralyzed in an instant. The huge airliner, a symbol of stability, turned into an uncontrolled object, where hundreds of lives depended on the desperate attempts of 3 pilots to find at least some loophole in this hopelessness. And all this is because of the same mistake in the repair many years ago, because of a couple of rivets and parts that have not stood the test of time. But the crew didn't know the real reason yet. All that was obvious to them was the terrible reality: their management had disappeared, which meant that their profession and their power over the car had disappeared. Now they had to do the impossible: learn how to fly an airplane that was devoid of all controls. When the tail was blown off and the liner lost control, for passengers it was the moment when the familiar world split into before and after. Everything that seemed mundane a minute ago, tea in plastic cups, conversations about work, sleepy children at the window, has now disappeared under the pressure of panic. The cabin was filled with a roar of air, the whistle of torn panels, the smell of hot metal. Masks on hoses swayed to the beat of the chaotic movements of the plane, and people reached out to them as if to the last hope. The flight attendants, who were instructed to remain calm, struggled with oxygen starvation themselves. Their instructions sounded jerky. They shouted over the noise, "Put on masks. Take a deep breath." Some of the passengers wrote down the last words to their relatives right on the back of the boarding pass. Someone held the children's hands tightly, and someone, having lost control, tried to jump up and run down the aisle. But there was nowhere to run. The metal shell became a cage, shaking and diving in crazy trajectories. And no less madness was happening in the cabin. The pilots suddenly found themselves in a position they had never been in decades of work. The controls that normally controlled every muscle of the plane now seemed like toys. The nose of the car flew up and down, the wings alternately burrowed into the air, and none of the usual techniques helped. The crew realized the terrible thing: they themselves became passengers in their own cabin. The only thing they have left are the engines. The 4 giant turbines that generated thrust could be adjusted manually. But they weren't designed to be controlled. It's like trying to drive a car with just the gas and the brake, no steering wheel, no gearbox. The pilots knew that even the slightest delay or a mistake with thrust could cause the plane to either crash down or flip over. At the same time, a new danger was coming at them: hypoxia. At an altitude of 24,000 feet, the oxygen in the atmosphere is 3 times less than that of the Earth. The brain stops thinking clearly, vision narrows, and movements become slow. They were fighting for control of the plane, but at the same time they were losing control of their own bodies. Their words became jerky, their commands were not fully understood. At that moment, the difference between the cabin and the cabin almost disappeared. There, people were praying, crying, and clinging to masks. Here were 3 professionals who, under normal conditions, could land this plane anywhere in the world, but now they were just as desperately clinging to life, trying to persuade the car to obey with 4 engines. And if the passengers in the cabin felt like prisoners, then in the cockpit the commander and co-pilot experienced the same helplessness. The giant, who had been completely obedient 10 minutes ago, was now living his own life. The liner rocked, fell, soared up and fell again, as if demonstrating, "You don't control me anymore." But despite this desperation, no one in the cockpit gave up. Even the flight engineer, seeing how all the hydraulic systems had died, continued to check alternatives, reported on the state of the systems, and looked for at least some way to influence what was happening. And it is this stubborn struggle, despite the doom of the situation, that will later become the main symbol of this flight. When it became clear that not a single steering wheel, not a single pedal, no longer had power over the aircraft, the crew's attention focused on the last instrument, the engines. For turbines, each the size of a bus, were the only way to change the behavior of the multi-ton liner. But engines were never conceived as a means of control, they created thrust rather than turning the wings. Still, the pilots had no choice. The commander gave the order, "We're trying the engines." This meant a new experiment, not described in textbooks, to learn how to fly using only thrust power. Theoretically, this was possible. If you reduce the thrust, the plane will lose speed and turn its nose down. If you add it, it will lift its nose and begin to gain altitude. For turns, it was possible to use asymmetry, to give a little more power to the left engines and less to the right ones, or vice versa. But in practice, it was like trying to steer a ship by rowing with only one oar when the current was carrying you into a whirlpool. Their first experience was chaotic. Increased thrust, the nose soared up too sharply. Removed, the liner crashed in a dive. The car reacted with a delay, as if mocking the pilots. The levers of the engines were in their hands, but the plane did what it wanted. The giant obeyed only partially, and each movement required incredible precision and endurance. Passengers felt these attempts as an endless attraction. The liner plunged sharply down, forcing people to squeeze into the straps, then jerked upward, nailing them to their seats. But these wild fluctuations weren't accidental, it was the crew trying to tame the steel beast. And at some point, there was a small glimmer of hope. By coordinating their movements, the commander and co-pilot managed to muffle the fury of the roller coaster. The amplitude of the fugo oscillations has become smaller, not 5,000 feet up and down, but 2 or 3. For the average passenger, it was still a nightmare, but for the professional in the cockpit, it was a tiny success. They proved to themselves that there is no completely lost control, even if only the most primitive way of managing remains. Now they faced a new choice. The dispatcher in Tokyo offered to land at the nearest major airport, in Nagoya. But the captain decided otherwise. "We're going back to Haneda." His logic was cold and simple. Haneda is bigger, closer to the sea, there are more emergency services and rescue resources. He understood that if they could bring this plane to the ground, it would not be a landing, but a controlled collision. And for such a test, maximum support is needed. And yet, despite their determination, their situation remained almost hopeless. The engines could not compensate for the lack of a tail. Each pull on the levers was like a guessing game, a little harder, and the plane lifts its nose, a little weaker, and it falls down. And all this happened against the background of the incessant Dutch step, the very swaying from side to side that made people in the cabin feel sick and terrified. However, where others would have already resigned themselves, these three continued to fight. There was an atmosphere of extreme tension in the cabin. Everyone understood that the chance of salvation was 1 in 1,000, but no one allowed themselves to give up. And it was at this moment that they first thought about a new obstacle. They could somehow keep the plane in the air, but ahead was Japan, a land of mountains. To return to Haneda, it was necessary to overcome a mountain range. And that meant not only stabilizing the airliner, but also forcing it to gain altitude when it was barely in the air. Japan is a country of mountains, and it was they who became the crew's new opponent. If at the beginning of the journey the liner was flying over the calm surface of the bay, now the dark jagged silhouette of the mountain range loomed ahead. The pilots saw it on their instruments, and passengers at the portholes noticed how the shadows of the peaks began to obscure the sunset. And all this was coming faster than we would have liked. For an ordinary airplane, flying over mountains is a trivial task. The autopilot smoothly gains altitude, the wings respond to the slightest movement of the steering wheel, and the engines only maintain the rhythm. But here everything is different. The crew had no rudder, no flaps, no stabilizer. Only 4 engines and the hope that their power will be able to lift the multi-ton hull above the crest. The captain gives the command, maximum thrust. The levers pull forward, the turbines roar louder than ever, and the liner begins to slowly creep upward. But this victory turns into a new threat. The nose of the plane lifts up too sharply, the speed drops, and now the vibration in the steering wheel warns of the danger of stall. It's like climbing a sheer cliff, a little slower and you'll fall down. They take away the thrust, and immediately fall to the opposite extreme. The nose drops, the speed increases, but with it the threat of crashing directly into the slope increases. The cabin is filled with screams of alarms. The flight engineer monitors the instruments, but his eyes betray something that cannot be hidden. The situation is getting out of control. In the cabin, it all turns into a hellish attraction. People are thrown back and forth, someone is losing consciousness from overloads, children are crying, adults are trying to hold their breath under masks. Someone is praying, someone is whispering the name of loved ones, someone is looking out the window and sees mountains that are getting closer. And yet, in this turmoil, the crew is doing the impossible. They learn to feel the plane differently. Instead of the usual connection via handlebars and pedals, they rely on delays in the reaction of engines, on the slightest changes in speed and sound. Their movements are becoming more precise, a little more thrust, and the nose rises just enough to pass the next wave of vibrations. A little less, and the plane does not go into a peak, but is held at the limit of controllability. But mountains don't forgive mistakes. They grow in front of the wall, and each new peak is higher than the previous one. The crew understands that they must not just stay in the air, but find a balance between lift and speed, otherwise everything will be over in a matter of minutes. This struggle was like playing with a giant pendulum. The plane was swinging, falling and taking off, and the pilots were trying to catch the moment when this swing would allow them to fly over the ridge. They used every grain of energy, every jerk of the engines, every moment when the giant obeyed them for even a second. And so, as if on the edge of a precipice, the nose of the liner shot up, the engine howled at the limit, and the plane began to climb higher. The metal vibrated, and the stall alarm came to life again, warning that just a little more and the wings would lose lift. But the last chance was opening up below them. If they held this climb for a few more seconds, they could jump over the jagged mountains. The passengers in the cabin felt only one thing: unbearable rocking and heaviness, as if their bodies were pinned to their seats. But for the pilots, it was the moment of truth. Either they would lead the steel giant over the mountains, or everything would end right here on the slope, far from rescuers and help. When the mountains were left behind, for the first time in the cabin there was a feeling, albeit illusory, but still, that they had time. Just a few minutes ago, it seemed that the plane would crash into the slopes, and now, having overcome the ridge, the crew saw a tiny chance. But with this chance came a new realization: the way they were flying now, they couldn't make it to the airport. Each jerk of the engines provided only a temporary respite. To get closer to Haneda, they needed to stabilize the airliner at least a little, otherwise they would simply be smeared on the ground. The captain and the co-pilot exchanged short phrases. The decision was risky: to use systems that were still alive. Flaps and landing gear. Theoretically, their release could change the aerodynamics of the wing, add stability, and reduce the risk of a tailspin. It was a step into the dark, but there was no other option. The command is given instantly. The flight engineer activates the auxiliary electrical system, which, unlike the hydraulics, was still working. The flaps begin to move slowly. In the cabin, passengers hear a strange screeching sound and feel as if the plane is slowing down for a second. At first, it seems that this helps. The height fluctuations become a little softer, the roll seems to be dulled. People are clasping their hands in prayer, and the crew is watching the instruments with bated breath. But the joy doesn't last long. The electrical system was weaker, and the flaps began to diverge unevenly. They went out further on the left wing than on the right. There was an asymmetry. Instead of stability, the liner began to roll slowly but surely to the right. The co-pilot noticed this, tried to compensate with thrust, increased power on the left, removed it on the right. But with such inertia, the difference turned out to be fatal. The plane began to spin, which was impossible to stop. Inside, it looked like a catastrophic lurch. People were thrown against the walls, screams filled the aisles. Someone lost his mask, someone clung to the chair in front, someone squeezed his eyes shut, realizing that the end could not be avoided. The metal body creaked and groaned, as if it itself understood that its strength was running out. In the cabin, the alarm system overwhelmed everything. The red lights were flashing, the sirens were ringing, the controls were shaking in the pilot's hands, but they remained dead. They shouted commands at each other, struggled with the levers of the engines, but the reaction came too late or was completely absent. The plane wouldn't obey. He fell on his side, lost height and went down in a spiral. There was no horizon under the wing anymore, only mountains, getting closer and closer. At the last moment, as if in a desperate attempt to escape, the crew gave full throttle. The four engines roared in unison, and the plane lifted its nose, but the roll was already too great. The right wing console grazed the crest. There was a screech, the wing and the engine were torn off. The giant rolled over on its back, lost its integrity and crashed into the slope with a crash. From the outside, it looked like a flash against the background of the forest, a fireball that dozens of eyewitnesses saw. Flight 123's mark disappeared on the dispatcher's radar screens. The attempt, which cost the crew their last strength, ended with the flight. But the story didn't end there. What happened after the impact, and how the authorities reacted, opened up new wounds no less painful than the disaster itself. When the fireball engulfed the mountainside, it seemed that no one had a chance left. The controllers who had lost the Flight 123 tag on their radars knew that this was the end. But the Earth always holds surprises, and even in such disasters there are miracles. Among the piles of twisted metal, in the dark forests of Nagano, someone was still breathing. The military was the first to report the tragedy. A Japanese fighter jet in the area noticed the flash and transmitted the coordinates. Almost immediately, the Americans offered help. Their USAF transport plane was nearby and was ready to take off in search of it. But the Japanese authorities, driven by bureaucracy and political prestige, declined the help. The decision sounded harsh. The search would be conducted only on its own. On Earth, this meant only one thing: procrastination. Rescue services were in no hurry to move out at night, considering that there could be no survivors after such a collision. And only by dawn, more than 12 hours after the disaster, the first groups of rescuers began to make their way along inaccessible trails into the mountains. The picture that opened in the morning shocked even the most experienced. Fragments of the hull, wings, and engines lay in the dense forest on the slopes. The smell of aviation fuel hung in the air, mixed with smoke. But the most unexpected thing was the screams. For survivors were found between the wreckage. They were in the back of the plane, and somehow, incredibly, it was this place that gave them the chance. A young girl, a woman with a child, and several other passengers managed to survive the night in the mountains, in the cold, amid the chaos of metal. Their bodies were scarred, but their hearts continued to beat. Doctors would later say that many others could have survived if help had come at night instead of in the morning. But bureaucracy and disbelief in miracles cost dozens of lives. This was the second blow for the whole country. People mourned not only the disaster itself, but also that help had come too late. The relatives of the victims asked themselves a terrible question: how many of their loved ones could have remained alive if rescuers had acted faster? The story of these four survivors has become a symbol of both hope and pain. Hope, because even in such conditions, a person is able to fight and survive. Pain, because the country realized that the tragedy was aggravated not only by technology, but also by human decisions after it. And yet even this disaster had consequences that changed aviation forever. The crash of Flight 123 became a national wound for Japan, and a lesson for aviation around the world that could not be ignored. No one could afford to repeat the scenario where one hidden defect turns an entire plane into an uncontrollable giant. The manufacturer, Boeing, was the first to get involved. The designers have revised the entire concept of the tail bulkhead. Now, on the 747, it was designed so that even with a sudden pressure surge it would not collapse catastrophically. Reinforced elements, additional layers, new methods of strength control, all this has become mandatory. The most important change affected the hydraulic systems. Engineers added the so-called hydraulic fuses. They work like plugs in a water pipe. If one part of the system is damaged, the liquid does not completely escape, but a pressure reserve is maintained. This meant that in the future, the loss of the tail section would not lead to a complete loss of control. The Japanese airline was also under attack. The society demanded an answer. How did it happen that a plane with substandard repairs carried passengers for decades? JAL has changed its approach to maintenance, increased control over repairs, tightened inspections, and increased the frequency of inspections of critical nodes. Every bolt, every rivet was now under double supervision. The airline created separate divisions that were responsible only for the quality of repairs, eliminating the possibility of paper reports without real verification. But not a single technical change could stifle the public blow. Japan plunged into mourning. For weeks after the disaster, JAL flights were half empty, people were afraid to board planes. The trust that had been built over the years was destroyed one August night. For a country with a special attitude to discipline and trust in the system, this came as a shock. Nevertheless, it was this disaster that pushed aviation to even greater safety. Today, every passenger boarding a plane benefits from the results of those changes, from improved bulkheads and safety guards to new rules for rescue operations. Now, no state postpones the search until morning. Help is coming immediately, even if there is little chance. After all, the tragedy of Flight 123 proved that sometimes dozens of lives depend on delay. This flight went down in history as the largest single plane crash. Nevertheless, it became not only a symbol of pain, but also a point after which aviation took a step forward. Because every such tragedy turns into a warning, metal does not forgive mistakes, and human decisions even more so.